First time trying to start it in 40 years. Fuel tank's leaking. Today we're looking at the fuel tank on a Evinrude Sportsman from 1950. This is a 1.5 horsepower motor, and the upper section that I have removed off the outboard is the tank, and the very top section, of course, is the recoil or simplex. Here's the trap door, and it opens to reveal this slider clip that then moves out of the way, and you lift up the fuel cap. Now this thing is supposed to be supple, and it's pretty hard. This is pretty stiff. I don't know if it'll seal. Probably not, but we'll see. Looking down inside this tank, it was cleaned by my dad and my brother years ago, and as you can see, it's pretty clean on the inside. Now, this tank is made with screws that hold the upper and lower section together, and there was no gasket in the parts diagram, only some kind of a sealant, and it looks like they may have used a Permatex 2B, which is a black fuel-proof sealant. What I want to examine now is this on-off switch. This turns on the fuel, dispensing it through here, and this line was cut and a filter was inserted in response to this tank having been gummed up at one point. Anyway, this, when you turn the fuel on, not only does it allow fuel to go this way, it has a vent that feeds a little tube to the top of the tank so that air is let back into the fuel tank while you're motoring. So I'm going to take this apart and examine and see what's in here. Okay, so this is about to come apart. Or it's stuck. It may take two hands to break the seal. So as I rocked it back and forth, this upper section peeled off of the metal frame, and there's the rubber gasket. I don't know what that material was made out of. It could have been out of a piece of inner tube that I gave my brother several years ago for this, but I don't know if that'll hold up to gasoline. The springs were stuck to this rubber gasket, so I pulled them off, and now I'm tipping it back, and there are metal discs on the inside, and so you got to make sure we put the discs back in the same orientation. And it looks like they have a bump that goes up. This one's really sticky and gummy, so I'm sure this inner tube is not going to suffice. And that's just the rocker arm. I've cleaned these two discs off, and here's how this works. This is in the on position. That would retract these two metal discs from squeezing the rubber gasket material against these two tips, this one being the fuel and this one being the vent. And then sliding this lever the other way raises these discs. I don't know if you can see it going up and down. I did take this fuel switch off, and here are the parts. There's the lever, the springs, the discs, and the new gasket that I have. But I'm going to put a little bit of chemical-proof sealer around this. This is the port that feeds to the carburetor. This has a drain hole. This is the vent to let air in, but if you turn the tank and fuel comes back through this pipe, it'll end up dribbling out this vent hole anyway. So this part doesn't need to be sealed, but this part does need to be sealed. I spread just a little trace of Permatex 2, which is fuel proof, so you can see it right there. Next go the springs, then the gasket, Then the discs go on. Then put this valve assembly on. Finger tighten the screws to make sure the gasket is aligned properly before you tighten it. Screws are tightened securely. And just check operation. You can see it closing, see it opening. So that should do it. Turn the tank upside down. Remove all of these screws. There are a total of 14. With the screws out, gently pry the tank halves apart. You'll find what looks like a gasket, but is in fact sealer, and you'll have to peel it off with your thumbnail or plastic blade of some kind and scrape all of that material out. I used a wood chisel laid flat on the surface to scrape some of the gasket off. The section that had the grooves in it was cleaned out, but you can't see it very well. There was still debris in the bottom that had to be cleaned out. The upper section was nice and clean. Using a wire wheel, I went over both sections of the tank to clean off any remaining debris and get the debris out of the grooves. The screws have sealer on them and must be cleaned off, and I used the same wire wheel and cleaned all 14 screws, as you can see. Take a tap wrench and chase the threads to clean out old sealer and remove any debris. Check the screws to make sure they go in. An AOMCI member on the internet suggested using a long screw to align the fuel tank halves, because once the two halves are together, you're not supposed to slide it around or the sealer will break down. So in my case, I used 2 pieces of threaded rod, and you can see how it aligns as the tank halves go together. Then once you confirm it goes together, take it back apart. Using parts cleaner on a rag, I wiped down the surfaces very carefully and continued doing it until the rag was clean after wiping it. Apply the surface prep to both the upper and lower sections of the tank. Let the surface prep cure for 5 minutes before applying the sealer. Using a good grade anaerobic gasket maker, apply a bead to 1/2 of the fuel tank. Generally, you want to put it on the side that has the groove and fill the groove up. Carefully place the other section, aligning the 2 threaded rods into the tank section. Notice that I've propped up 1/2 of the fuel tank on some cans so that the rods will go all the way through. Flip the tank over so that the threaded rods are pointing up. Then take the anaerobic sealer and fill the screw holes with the sealer. Now you'll only be able to do 12 of them because 2 threaded rods are blocking the holes, but you'll get those in the next step. After all the holes are filled, finger start the 12 screws, then snug them diagonally until they're all tight. And at this point, the anaerobic sealer will start to harden. Remove the 2 threaded rods, then fill the 2 remaining holes with the anaerobic sealer, then thread in the 2 remaining screws and tighten them. As you've tightened all the screws, the sealer will ooze out of the seams between the upper and lower halves of the tank. Use a rag or a paper towel with carb cleaner and wipe off all of the excess that's squeezed out between the seams. You can see just a thin line of the red anaerobic sealer after it's all been wiped down. Looking at the underside of the tank, inspect all the screws to make sure that anaerobic sealer was oozing out around the screws. Let the sealer cure for 24 hours. Now that the tank has been sealed together and left to cure for a while, I wanted to test and see if it leaked without putting liquid in it or pumping it up and putting it in the tank of water. So I hooked up a vacuum tester, but I realized that the vent here lets air out when you open this valve. If you close the valve, it just stops here and there's no air getting in. So what I did was I opened it up and I pushed on this with a screwdriver that held the vent closed, and I was able to pump it up to 5 inches and it was holding pressure, but I can't do that and take a picture at the same time. The vacuum is holding at 4 inches of mercury. Now comes the real test. When I put fuel in it, does it leak? You should be able to see the fuel in there sloshing around. So now I'm going to tilt it all directions and see if it's leaking. There's a little leak of gas right at the cap, but not from the seam. I don't know why that's leaking. It's a new old stock cap and a new gasket. The rest of this all seems dry. Yay. Now to reassemble everything, tip the motor up and take your fuel line off. It'll be easier to put all the screws in to hold it back together. The screws are secured. The screws for the recoil unit are all installed. Gas cap and its screw, that's all installed. Now for the side covers. Start on the tiller side and loosely start the side cover screws, but don't tighten it yet. Then turn the motor around the other way, loosely start the side cover, and then there are dimples and recesses on the front and rear end of these covers that have to align. Squeeze them together and then tighten the screws. The tank resealing for this Evinrude Sportsman 1.5 horsepower fuel tank is complete. Thanks for watching.